So just to start, I'm excited to have so many participants today. And we did ask you where you came from and what's the type of institution that you're working for. And it's really exciting to see that people are coming from all over the world, which indicates that research performance is something very relevant and of great interest to the community. Obviously, the majority of registrations were from the UK, which is where CYGNA is located, but we have people registered from Australia, Finland, Belgium, South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, which is wow. Most of you came from an institution which pays a lot of attention to research, but also from institutions which maybe have more modest research ambitions, which might change in the future, because this is where, in general, the trend is going towards high research intensiveness, whether it's sustainable or not. And quite a substantial number works for institutions which have international accreditation, which then creates this additional pressure to be research active and to demonstrate research excellence. So glad to see you all. And what we are going to talk about today is maybe slightly different than most of the sessions that I attended on this topic in a variety of conferences, where the main focus was on how you improve your own research performance. I would like us to look at this phenomena from a slightly different perspective, from the perspective of managers, of people who manage research performance. And I know that there is this wide conversation that research management is something which is imposed upon researchers by evil managers who want you to publish all those papers in top journals so that they could improve the rankings of institution and attract more international students who pay high fees. And I'm sure there's a kernel of truth in this perception, but I don't think it's the full truth. And first of all, there are some really good reasons why we should publish our research and why our research is beneficial. And also, most of the managers with whom I had the pleasure of interacting were probably more clueless and overwhelmed than truly evil. The majority of them were academics themselves, and they were just honestly trying to do something to make sense of this diversity of research which happens in their department or faculty or institution. So I think it's useful to have an insight into how this looks from the other side. So I want us today to take a more strategic view on research management. I was just earlier this week at the conference on research management and administration. And it was very interesting, but it's a very different type of research management. We all know that side, the tactical side of research management, all the timesheets and application forms and many, many other bureaucratic policies which are part of the researcher's life. And again, that's important, but I would like us to have a more high-level conversation about why we're doing things the way we're doing them in research and how we can organize research in a more productive way. So my presentation builds on the literature review paper, which Jolanta and I have published this year in Research Policy. You all had the link to it in your email which CYGNA sent you, inviting you to this seminar. So I'm not going to show you the DOI and the rest. You have it all. So essentially, we were trying to see what organizations can do to improve individual research performance of academics. So I'm going to briefly go through key insights from this literature review, and then we can have a conversation on some of the topics which might be of interest to you from this. So in the spirit of management, I'm going to start with talking about money, because this is where it all starts and ends. Well, no, it mostly starts with our curiosity about how things work in society, but it very quickly goes down to this issue of, do we have resources to do this research? So when we there's a very substantial literature which talks about funding as something which supports research performance of academics. And while there is a general agreement that having more funding is better than having less, there are also some challenges if your funding is very fragmented. So if you're getting lots of small grants, the cost of administering those grants, all this paperwork, all those interim reports and deliverables and hiring PhD students and everything else starts to take so much of your time that you don't really have time to do the actual research and publish papers or books or whatever research outputs you want to have from it. And in the ideal world, you have administration teams which do things for you. But we are not in the ideal world, and we know from evidence that there is a very substantial gap between what the cost of doing research and the amount of funding that we are getting. So it was actually quite surprising to me. I don't have a very extensive experience with funding, that funding, external funding that academics bring into universities normally doesn't cover all the costs. So university still has to put extra money into covering expenses. So there's clearly a case for having small number of larger grants, but you have to be realistic, and early career researchers probably cannot do this. So you have to allow for the experience in getting funding and career stage, which is more or less the same thing. And it's fine to have smaller grants and more of them early on. But then the question for managing the pipeline is, do you have at some stage smaller grants turning into larger grants? So you need to take researchers on a journey from a smaller grant to a larger grant. And this doesn't always happen naturally. So there is clearly a need for some structured intervention. So the second issue with funding is that there is the increasing amount of industry funding that government would like us to attract. And it's very attractive conversation, because first of all, if industry is paying for research, government has to pay less. And also there's an assumption that industry only pays for research which is relevant to practice. So you're kind of getting two benefits out of the same action. You are getting money to do research, and you are creating societal impact of your research. So all of this is wonderful, but the literature shows that the best proportion of industry funding in the funding portfolio of an academic is no more than 1/3. So if an academic has more than 1/3 of their funding coming from industry, then those competing goals, the different deliverables which industry wants versus what academia requires, becomes the impediment for research productivity. Some of the outputs from this research might not even be publishable if you're working with industry partners who are very concerned about confidentiality of their data. And even if you are kind of successful in working with those industry partners, the more you interact with industry by attracting industry funding, the higher is the probability that researchers would end up getting jobs outside of academia. So you are going to lose those researchers because private sector will offer them better salary. So there is definitely some balance which needs to be achieved here. And I think one of the opportunities to make the most of industry funding is to integrate it into PhD training. So those industrial doctorates that are very attractive but not very common, whatever is the conversation, it's actually no more than 5%. So if your PhD students are working on your projects which have industry funding, you are preparing them for jobs in academia and outside of academia as well. So this is beneficial for them as well. Right, so moving from external funding to the internal resource allocation. So what we've seen from the literature is that there is a choice that managers need to make because different strategies support short-term and long-term research performance. Obviously, we want to have both, but it doesn't quite work like this. So if you need a short-term performance boost, you need to identify already productive researchers and concentrate your resources to support them today. So they will respond to this because literature shows that actually monetary and other rewards work quite well for academics. We're not as altruistic as we would like to think about ourselves, which is perfectly fine. We're just another occupation. But when you do this, you also increase the risk that those highly productive academics would become an attractive goals for poaching at the labor market. So they will be lured away from your institution. And if you don't want them to leave, you would have to invest increasing amount of resources to keep them in your institution. So their cost would increase. And if you lose them because you have accumulated resources to support a small pool of highly productive research stars, they will take away a substantial share of your research performance with them. So that's quite risky. The alternative is to spread your money more equally between those who are already productive and those who maybe only have a promise of being productive. And then in the long term, you will have a wider pool of productive researchers in your institution. The problem with this is that those who are already productive will see that they are not being rewarded proportionally their current performance, and that would be discouraging for them. Some of them would decrease their research performance because they're not being appreciated enough for their amazing productivity. Others might even leave. So in the short term, this would lead to the stagnation or even decrease of your research performance. So it's a long game. And to play this long game, you need to be sure that you have enough political capital as, I don't know, a dean, a research director, a head of department, because you will be under pressure from both your faculty, who would be unhappy that you're not supporting productive researchers, and your top management, your academic leaders, who would ask you why your numbers are going down and what is it that you're doing wrong and why you're not responding to the concerns of productive people. So you need to have this political capital to withstand the pressure and to play this long game. It's not much different from any other organization in any other industry, but it's useful to think about it. Okay, so moving from financial capital to other types of capital, we have found surprisingly small number of empirical studies which give us any insight into how we should organize our campuses so that academics are more productive. We know that researchers really need collaboration spaces and opportunities for serendipitous meeting each other, ideally cross disciplines, if we want to have interdisciplinary research, but we also need quiet spaces where researchers can focus on just thinking about science and doing science without being constantly interrupted by students and colleagues. So there is this need for a variety of workspaces, which I don't think is being catered to. At least I haven't seen this in many places. So I've been visiting some
individual research
partner institutions recently, and there are open spaces everywhere, which is good for collaboration, not so good for the second part. And the second, there was a question in the registration survey about the future of online conferences. And I think this is another conversation where we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. Every one of us have attended both physical and online conference at some stage and has an opinion on how this works. But we don't have enough scientific evidence to support decision-making about which conferences should be online, which should be remote or hybrid. And there is absolutely no nuance in the conversation about this scientific communication, what works and what doesn't, on how this differs by your geographical location, whether you are in London or in Trinidad and Tobago, or according to your career stage, whether you are just out of your PhD and have very small social capital and really need to build the networks, or whether you're a full professor who already has more co-authors and collaborators that you can possibly imagine. So I think we are letting ourselves down by not studying those topics, because if we are not providing any systematic evidence on what works for us, then decision-making will be based on hard cash and gut feeling of decision makers, and it might not be the outcome that we like. Continuing on the topic of human capital and researchers, the literature provides quite convincing evidence that peer support really matters, which is what CYGNA provides to us to some extent. But we also have seen the evidence that informal mentoring is not enough. So if you really want to see the improvement in research performance, mentoring has to be a formal process in your institution with a proper reward system for mentors, with selection of mentors who are maybe knowledgeable in the current state of academia, because not every professor who has done their PhD 30 years ago is aware of how labor market for PhDs looks at the moment. So you need to really think this through. And I would argue for portfolio approach to mentoring. What this means is having not one mentor, but a constellation of mentors specializing in different aspects of academic careers. And this just links to the next insight, is that research performance is a multidimensional construct. So different behaviors contribute to different outcomes. So you might, and there are trade-offs between having high volume versus having high number of citations. There is fairly high correlation, but still some of the behaviors might support one and not support another. And same with different types of impact. Achieving very high traditional scholarly impact doesn't mean that someone is really good at achieving societal impact and connecting to practice, and vice versa. Someone might be amazing at communicating with practitioners, but have very modest scholarly impact in the sense of number of citations. And that's fine. I think it's unreasonable to expect a person to be excellent at everything. And I think we need to have an appreciation that this is something that we need to manage. And there are different ways of doing this. One way is to have different career paths, career tracks, where someone specializes on research only and others specialize on connecting with industry and yet others on teaching. There are pros and cons of this. And I would argue that this works well in some institutions and not so well in others, because you probably would like to have some research-informed aspects in your teaching, and you would probably want to produce research which has some relevance to practice. And if you're separating people into specializations, you're not really working towards this integration. So another way of doing this is to pay attention to maybe career stages, because at different stages of their careers, people are probably better or more interested in one aspect or another. And then instead of trying to get the maximum of all dimensions from every single person at every single time, you manage them as a portfolio. At the end of the day, a department chair or a research director needs to tell a narrative at the faculty or department or university level. So it doesn't really make much sense to focus that obsessively on individual level of analysis. You need to have enough of every aspect of research performance at the aggregated level and manage this portfolio in a diversified kind of way. And then finally, another trade-off that was clear in the literature is in relation to how we educate our doctoral students and the degree of autonomy that we're giving them. So the research autonomy here is their ability to choose their own topic and work on this topic, according to their own perception of what is interesting, which might not necessarily align with their research supervisor research interest. And we see that if we give PhDs more autonomy, it takes them usually more time to publish. But on the other hand, what they produce is more novel in terms of scientific insights. So this looks like a wonderful achievement to have PhDs producing truly original knowledge. But you have to be realistic about the labor market. And especially if you are in a more peripheral and younger institution and your PhD graduates are not going to get a job just on the, on the force of your institutional brand, and they really need to show some published work at the end of the day, then you probably need to restrict their autonomy a little bit or a lot, put them into faculty research projects so that they can work on them early on and publish, and then later allow them to work on their own ideas, which is exactly how US market used to operate. In the US PhD, you wouldn't have a chance to work on your own project until year 3 or sometimes even 4, but you worked on someone else's research project as a research assistant from the first semester of your PhD, and then you would have a paper published by the end, and that would be your labor market paper. So employability, I think, matters because we have a duty of care to our doctoral students so that they have a job if they want to go into academia, which is an if. If they don't want to go into academia after PhD, then it's fine. You know, they have other plans. We need to support them in employment, which doesn't require them to have publications. But then the final question that I want to ask here, if we are supervising, if we are giving lots of research autonomy to PhDs and allow them to go with where their own intellectual curiosity leads them, it's likely that at some stage they will publish their work, but it wouldn't necessarily be together with their supervisors. So the question is, why would anyone want to supervise a PhD student who wouldn't publish in their field? I don't know how it is in your institutions, but in our institution, hours that you spend with your PhD students are not part of your teaching allocation. So there's an assumption that you are spending sometimes an hour or more every week with a PhD student because you're being rewarded by joint publications with this PhD student. So if publications are not happening because PhD student is doing something else or going into non-academic job and isn't interested in publishing at all, then you need to put in place other types of reward systems for PhD supervisors.